Okay, silence for the master. Oh, sorry, that's me. Fellow masters, gallant and learned clerks, liverymen, members, guests, I am delighted to welcome you to our Tymms lecture. Thank you all for joining us this evening. We are especially privileged to have no less than 30 masters here, representing, together with some other masters-elects and past masters, 34 of the city's 113 livery companies. So thank you so much all for coming. In my 6 months as master, the lectures that I've attended as a guest of other livery companies have been among the most memorable events of the year. They are an important part of any livery company's programme, and I'm thrilled to see so many of you here for what I'm confident will be an equally gripping and memorable evening. Sir Frederick Tymms was a founder member of the Guild of Air Pilots, as we were called then, back in 1929, and served as master in 1957 to 1958. He was instrumental in securing livery status for the Guild in 1956, crowning a distinguished aviation career. Having joined the Royal Flying Corps in 1917, he went on to pioneer international air routes in Africa and in India before serving as the UK's representative on the ICAO Council in 1947. Sir Frederick was, in every sense, a true airman. I wish to thank our own Director of Aviation Affairs, who sadly can't be here this evening, and our office staff for organising this event, but especially past master Dr. Michael Fopp for presenting to us this evening the result of some new research he has carried out on the Battle of Britain on this, the 85th anniversary of that battle. Michael has enjoyed a distinguished career in major museums, serving as keeper of the Battle of Britain Museum, director of the London Transport Museum, and Director General of the Royal Air Force Museums for 22 years. After retiring in 2010, he served as master of this company. An aviation and social historian specialising in the 20th century, Michael is a licensed aircraft pilot with commercial and instrument ratings. He has chaired aviation charities, acted as an expert witness on aviation safety, and flown a wide range of aircraft, from vintage machines to high-performance modern ones, including one that he built himself. Michael has lectured on a number of occasions on the Battle of Britain in the UK, the USA, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Hong Kong. As the son of a Battle of Britain pilot, it's a subject personal to him. He has also spoken at the Probert Lecture here in the RAF Club, at major international conferences, at the Smithsonian and at Seattle Town Hall, and is a visiting lecturer at City University here in London. He is very much in demand as an enrichment lecturer on cruise ships, but this evening you don't have to cruise anywhere to hear him speak. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Michael Fopp.
Thank you. Thank you, Master, and welcome to all the other livery companies that are present. And I can see an awful lot of faces in the room that I know, so I'm amongst friends. Because this subject I'm going to talk about tonight, let me just put some background to it. What I'm going to use, and I hope you can hear me okay at the back, good, because I'm going to use the Imperial War Museum, a fantastic institution, has recorded oral histories of a number of aviators, particularly from the Battle of Britain period. There's a few in this room they recorded actually, but they won't be available until they're dead and gone. The Battle of Britain veterans are, of course, sadly now all dead and gone. So I'm going to use, to illustrate and for you to hear what I've discovered them talking about when they were older men. As the Master said, I'm the son of a Battle of Britain pilot. I'm a son of one of the few, one of the 30 or so Australian Battle of Britain pilots, who was at the time in the Battle of Britain a sergeant pilot with number 17 Squadron. So as the Master said, I've been talking and researching the Battle of Britain since I can remember, really, and also was privileged to run the Battle of Britain Museum, as it was called many years ago. But what I haven't done, I've tended to do what everybody does, and that is to believe what I read And when I talk to veterans, and of course I've known the veterans since I was in my late 20s, and they were in their 40s, early 50s, so I knew so many of them. They also were talking about what they had read too, because they were interested in it. But as any of you who've served in the military will know, you know very little about what's going on when you're actually serving. The strategy, the actual purpose of what you're doing is never really necessarily explained to you. So their reiteration of their experiences was often a result of the same stuff I'd read, the stuff that had been published. So what I've done for this talk is I want to try and explain to you not anything. I'm assuming that most of you know what the Battle of Britain was, and I'm not even going to ask how many don't. I'm going to assume you know when it was and what it was. But what I want to do is I want to talk about the pilots, and they were all male, the fighter pilots. I'm not talking about the multi-crewed aircraft, I'm talking about the single crewed aircraft with one exception, which I will talk very briefly about. But I'm talking about who they were and what they went through. And I think that's quite important because very few of them ever spoke about what they really felt. Certainly not to their children. So occasionally they would speak to their grandchildren in more detail. And I've broken it down into, and it's initially the talk is about leadership and how that affected the average fighter pilot. What I've also done, and I'd like to say a thank you to people I don't know, is I've used colorized images wherever I can, as you can see here. Grumpy Unwin on the left there, you're going to hear him. That's the characteristic picture of fighter pilots of 1940, I think you'll agree. But it's been colorized. The reason I've done that is throughout my career, all I've been able to do really is show black and white photographs. Nowadays, with very clever people, they've managed to colorize them. But don't take the colors too seriously, because, for example, that life preserver in the middle was probably that color, but only if he painted it that color. It will have been the color of the one on the right. So let's look. Who was he and what did he go through? I'm going to put the talk into various aspects. I'll be 1 hour, ladies and gentlemen. And at the end of 1 hour, we have 15 minutes or so for questions. So by all means, store up the questions because I'll answer them as soon as I've finished. So I'm looking at these subjects that you can see. This screen behind me is wallpaper. The screen will have lots of facts on it and things, and I may not touch on any of them. What I will do is I'll talk around them and talk about them, because the subject I'm talking about is quite considerable. These are things we already know, the strategic planning and leadership. What we probably often forget is that after the Great War, 1418 Great War, we thought there would be no more wars for at least 10 years. And the governments of the day set their policy adjusted to that. And each 10 years as it came up, they extended it for another 10 years. Seem familiar? They had the policy that they would not, exactly as we had at the end of the Cold War, they had the same at the end of the First World War. So the plans that were made were dedicated to the fact there would not be another major conflict for 10 years, then there would not be another major, and so on, until it became very obvious that there would be. We also thought we'd fight the air war in the same way we fought the First World War. It would all be at very great arm's length. And we knew that we'd be bombed. We'd had that in the First World War. We knew that the bomber would always get through because we had the famous speech, the bomber will get through, by Baldwin. We knew that would happen, but we did not anticipate that the enemy would be 23 miles away from us. We thought they'd be a few hundred miles away. They would come over in nice, neat formations, and we would then attack them accordingly. We were lucky on a number of occasions with the things that we did prepare. The system that we put in to defend ourselves, done by Dowding and Park primarily, into strategic terms, was innovative. It was new. It had not, the Germans knew nothing about it. It was like the World Wide Web of today in the way it was constructed, although it was analog. It was all telephone lines. It was all with, of course, radar and the observer corps. And the whole way that we coordinated was incredible, and we all know this. This was the Dowding system. This is what meant we could put our aeroplanes in the air only when we knew where they needed to be. That's basically what we thought. The actual Royal Air Force itself was made up at the start of the Second World War with a mixture of personnel. I'm talking about pilots now. These people were taken from various backgrounds, but the leaders of the Royal Air Force, both at squadron level and at flight commander level, they were the product of a recruitment system that had been in the Royal Air Force since its inception in 1918. And it was a pretty interesting system. As it became clear that the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, was getting bigger and bigger and a real threat, it became clear that we were never going to be able to recruit enough people through the system that had been set up originally in 1918 through that method. So we introduced other methods of recruitment. The first method that came in 1918 was the Royal Air Force College at Cranwell in Lincolnshire. And that was specifically designed by Trenchard to be a single route for officers into the Royal Air Force. And that was even architecturally emphasised. Those of you who've been to Cranwell will know there's a big gate, and the only way into the college is through that gate. That was the single point of entry for anybody prior to short service commissions to get into the Royal Air Force as an officer. Trenchard also set up an incredible training system for apprentices for the technical trades at Holton, but they also always, Royal Air Force always had a mechanism whereby they could identify talent and let that talent become aircrew. And you'll hear in a moment from one of those who did it in that route. And then we have the weekend pilots, Royal Auxiliary Air Force, which still exists, but in the 1930s was a very important cadre of people, not just trained, they all had to be pilots already. That meant that they were already, before they joined the Royal Auxiliary Air Force, pretty wealthy, because you could not learn to fly privately unless you had a certain amount of money behind you. Therefore, the Royal Auxiliary Air Force at the time of the outbreak of the Second World War was full of people who had some form of background financial assistance. Same with the Royal Air Force College. There were fees to pay, there were uniforms to buy. So the answer was the Short Service Commission, and in peacetime the Royal Air Force was the only service that offered that route into the Royal Air Force. And the Short Service Commission and the Royal Air Force Volunteer Reserve, which came in only a couple of years before the Second World War, made up the majority of the aircrew and pilots in the Battle of Britain and the Battle of France. But the selection process was not very sophisticated. If you wanted to join the Royal Air Force in the pre-war years, it helped enormously if you'd been to a public school. It helped enormously if you knew somebody who was already in the Royal Air Force and they knew you. And when you went for interview, there were no psychometric testing. There was no test of your psychological awareness of combat or your ability to sustain mental pressures or tiredness. They wanted to know whether you could play rugby. They wanted to know whether you went fox hunting. They wanted to know if you knew, they knew your father, or you had any other connection, and so on and so on. There was, until the very start of the war, the system for recruitment was really very amateur. And as you can see there, one of the senior RAF medical officers said that breeding very definitely is of great importance. It's unlikely that the son of a coward would himself become a hero, for it is remarkable how heroism often runs in families. They're making assumptions about people that we now know, and I have to caveat almost everything I'm saying here, that all that I'm going to tell you about that happened in 1940 changed immediately afterwards as a result of what the Royal Air Force learned. So let's just look at the routes in. This is Grumpy Unwin. Incredible man, joined the Royal, well he's going to tell you in a moment, but these are lovely colorized pictures of him with his dog. But look at his decorations, DSO, DFM and bar. He had 14 and a half aerial victories, and he joined the Royal Air Force as an apprentice. Let's hear what he's got to say about joining the Royal Air Force
Well, my father was a coal miner.
Can you hear at the back?
Although at school I achieved the matriculation, the only job available there was down a coal mine. I had no intention of doing that. My headmaster at the time had been sent a copy of the pamphlet dealing with apprentices, and the RAF, so I read this and applied, and 3 weeks later I was in the RAF. And I took the administrative apprentice, simply because it was 2 years instead of 3. April 29 to April 31. Well, I was in the fighter squadron. I became a sergeant pilot. I started training in 1935 and joined 19th Squadron at Duxford in August 36. And I stayed with them all through to the beginning of 1941.
Grumpy Unwin got the name Grumpy because the day he joined 19th Squadron, not the day he joined, the day that 19th Squadron was sent to do its very first operational sortie, he was not scheduled to fly. And he moaned so much that he had the name Grumpy for the rest of his service career. He not only flew in the Battle of Britain, he took part in squadrons flying Mosquitoes, rocket firing towards the end of the war. After the war, he flew Brigands in Malaya against terrorists, 180 sorties commanding a squadron in Malaya, which is what he got the DSO for. Great golfer, lovely man. So that's the sergeant coming into the Royal Air Force. But you heard when he came in, 1936, he was a very well-trained, experienced pilot by the time of the Battle of France and the Battle of Britain. This is another route in, the Short Service Commission. And this is Grubby Grice.
I joined in November 1937. And I suppose the reason I joined was because I always wanted to learn to fly. From the time I started to learn to read, I was always interested in what happened in the pilots in the First World War. And then I got very keen later on Alan Cobham's flying circus. Then I remember listening to the Snyder Trophy races. That was a great thrill to hear those marvellous aeroplanes roaring past. And one thing led to another. My keenness to learn to fly went on. I couldn't afford to learn privately. So the only thing to do was to take a short service commission.
Was it money that stopped you going to Cranwell?
Oh yes, most certainly. My family weren't at all well off. Anyway, the thought of service life rather appealed. Service life before the war was really quite comfortable. And when I joined 32 Squadron later on, I discovered that the working week was Monday, Tuesday, Thursday and Friday. I mean, Wednesday was devoted to sport. And although one was on duty occasionally on Saturday morning, the rest of the weekend was free. And life stopped in the afternoon at about 4:30. It was quite a pleasant life, and couple that with 8-week holiday a year, it meant that life was certainly very enjoyable.
Grubby's had 8 victories, by the way. He was very badly burnt, as was my father. Grubby became a sector controller and a very, very senior controller within the Dowding system for the rest of the war. But I allowed him to speak. Most of my audio and video is less than 2 minutes, so don't get worried when you hear something. But I allowed Grubby to speak for 2 minutes and 10 seconds because of the bit at the end. That gives you a feeling of what the Royal Air Force was like prior to the Second World War. It was like a sports and social club. It was a very nice place to be. You had your comrades, you had your mates, you had your flying, you had your sport, you had your days off, and you were paid quite well as well. And also you wore a nice blue uniform, which the girls rather liked. So you'll hear, when you heard Sergeant Pilot Grumpy talking. Grubby then is the officer coming in on a short service commission. The one important thing that every one of them had was exceptional flying training. Not combat training, flying training. They all went through a process of learning to fly an aeroplane second to none, because the Royal Air Force had basically codified it way early when the Central Flying School was first founded back in the First World War. So the training of pilots that you have nearly all over the world now was codified first by the Royal Air Force. So the training these men were getting was incredible, but it was limited. Let's hear William Corbyn.
You done a few hours flying and done a bit of a formation flying with either 2 or 3 or maybe more, and then eventually with the squadron, then they called you operational. That means you were fit to be killed. First aerobatics I did was in the Spitfire. Told them I was the squadron commander. Right, Corbyn, here's your aircraft, go to 1 hour's aerobatic flying. I thought, Christ almighty, I've never done any aerobatic. So I thought, well, the loop must be the easiest thing. Because in my bloody ignorance and stupidity, I went up in this loop and I stole the bloody thing at the top through being around too fast, because they spun out the bloody top of it. That was my first experience.
So they were trained to fly the aeroplane very well, but as you heard, actually manoeuvring the aeroplane, they got that training when they went to their operational squadron. Now in the Royal Air Force, or any air force in the world, you have what operational training units and operational conversion units. And by the time you get to the squadron, you should be aware of virtually everything that you're expected to do, and then what your training involves after you get to the squadron is really continuation training and perfecting the skills and the role that your squadron actually has to apply. It wasn't like that in 1939, 1940. You arrived at the squadron and then you were trained and you were taught the tactics and everything that they had to, you had to learn. And I'll get to the tactics in a moment. But it meant, as the Battle of Britain, particularly after the Battle of France, as the Battle of Britain progressed, some young men were turning up at squadrons with 10 hours flying time on a Spitfire or a Hurricane and no experience of doing loops or rolls or any aerobatic manoeuvres, and they were immediately going out in combat. There was not time to give them the training they needed. There were a number of unforced errors, successes and deficiencies. I've talked about some of the successes. There had to be, after the Battle of France, the Battle of France was pretty disastrous for the Royal Air Force. 386 Hurricanes and 67 Spitfires were lost in the Battle of France. We had tactics that as soon as we came up against the Luftwaffe for the first time, we realized that they were doing different things than we were. The tactics we were using were not appropriate. But it was very difficult for some of the squadron commanders and flight commanders to get to grips with what had to change. And there was no push from above for them to change. So it was totally in the hands of individual commanders, whether flight or squadron commander, whether they actually adapted or didn't, or whether they forced their squadrons to actually operate with tactics that were known by the Luftwaffe and were taken advantage of by the enemy. There was also a performance aircraft versus enemy, which we didn't know about. The defensive armament of our aircraft was minimal during the Battle of France. They actually fitted armour plate behind the pilot's head and armour glass in the aeroplane's front windscreen on the airfields in June 1940 as a result of the experience they'd received in France. Self-sealing fuel tanks weren't brought in until quite late on, they were in before the Battle of Britain. We had 303 ammunition when our enemy had cannon, 22mm cannon. We harmonised our guns according to the tactics that we'd learned. 400 yards. You need to be within about 150, 200 yards to shoot a German aeroplane down, and we discovered that to our cost. We did have extremely good ground crews. The Holton system that had been brought in for apprentices proved its worth during the Battle of France and the Battle of Britain. Pilot training was not as good in terms of combat. So the Battle of France, we learned a lot of lessons. We flew out of tiny little strips like this with bell tents, and where a significant number, well, significant is not the right word, for a historian there is significant, numbers of commanders who did not fly. It was all too much. The Battle of France was such a mess, communication was so difficult, that they just didn't fly. They let their squadrons fly, they let their flight commanders take over the squadron. There was an awful lot of changes. And having researched this subject for many years, my own father's squadron, 17 Squadron, had 5 squadron commanders in 2 weeks. So it gives you some idea of the turnover. And they were using tactics which were straight out of a book for an air show, probably at Hendon once a year, where they all flew past in great formations. And these are extracts from the original documents, the tactics of the air fighting manual, where they had 6 forms of attack. And basically, as the leader, flight commander or squadron commander, saw the enemy approaching, he would call out to the rest of the squadron, attack number 1, attack number 5, attack number 6, and they would all be expected to move their formation around. The most favourite one was number 6, which was line astern, but everybody is trying their very best to keep their best formation. So if you could imagine the Red Arrows flying over Buckingham Palace the other day, or over Windsor Castle the other day, that's what they were trying to do. Meanwhile, the enemy is attacking them from various angles and various sides. So it really took some time, and it was not done, the changes were not done even into the Battle of Britain. There were still squadrons flying with these outdated, poor tactical formations in the Battle of Britain. These are the shapes that they eventually came up with straight out of the air fighting manual, the various shapes that any of you who are fighter pilots will know even to this day, and what they ended up with, the finger 4 and the 2. But things that they were doing, they realized, and they would end up making compromises because they didn't want to break the rules by not sticking to the manual, some flight or squadron commanders. So they would take the most junior member of the squadron, which was always a sergeant pilot. There was quite a hierarchy, and I'll talk about it a bit later because it affected quite a lot of what they did. They'll take the junior member of the squadron, probably the most inexperienced, and they will get him to act as tail end Charlie. And my father was tail end Charlie while he was a sergeant pilot. Luckily, he had 300 hours before he went on operations, because he'd been in the Royal Air Force as a volunteer reserve for 1.5 years, 2 years before the Battle of Britain. But this is him talking about being the tail end Charlie.
I'd been flying in a position which was very hairy, and it was called tail end Charlie. In the old days, before we did the open formations, the tight formations were covered by the chap at the back who was virtually a cover for the whole squadron, and he had the job of patrolling back and forward across the tail of the whole squadron, with keeping an eye out and letting them know if anything was coming. And of course he was the first to be picked off. I think I gained quite a lot of experience from that, because I never did manage to get anybody shooting at me, although I did warn the squadron a few times.
I now know from all the statistics I've read over the many years that it was sheer luck that my father was not killed doing that job, because basically all his chums were all looking at their leaders, and he was the only one who was looking for the Hun in the sun, for want of a better term, who was coming down on them at great speed. So that sort of tactic was poor in the extreme. We didn't know anything about the psychological impact of leadership and morale. Things like PTSD, combat stress, all those terms that we now take for read because we know about them, we did not know at that time. We did know eventually that age was a significant factor, and I'll talk about that more in a moment. The character of the leaders was hugely important. The motivation by the leadership was extremely important, and when I spoke to veterans, they would glowingly talk about the leaders that they respected and would follow basically anywhere. But there again, the reverse of the coin, a number of squadron commanders and flight commanders were taken off command as a result of the word that got back from their squadron mates. The regular and RAF reserve, they did not gel in the first year of the war, the Battle of France and the Battle of Britain. There was a separation. There was a hierarchical separation in terms of the social structures of the country at the time. And when you heard Gubby Grice talk about why he joined the Royal Air Force, all those things that they were doing in peacetime, suddenly they're at war. And suddenly it's not the game. We're not having every Wednesday sport in the afternoon. We're not stopping every Saturday and getting paid and 2 weeks leave every year and so on. It's now become very serious. And those that were commissioned or were given leadership roles in the late 1930s, by that time they were in their late 20s and they probably had a wife and family just very close to their home base, who they were thinking about rather than not thinking about. The speed of transition from student to pilot operations I've discussed already. It was so quick as to be dangerous as the Battle of France started and then the Battle of Britain came on. And also they became poster boys in the press. As soon as the Battle of Britain got underway, and particularly with politicians like Winston Churchill referring to them regularly on the radio, they became heroes. And they all would, not all, but the vast majority of them would wander around with their top button of their tunic undone, so the public knew they were fighter pilots, particularly the girls. But that was putting pressure on them, not only the pressure of combat and the pressure of their daily work, the fact that the public expected so much of them and had been told so much about them, they had to carry that weight on their shoulder as well. And the popular abiding image is this image. This is actually France and their Blenheim pilots, the twin-engine Blenheim. The popular image is everything that we have on the list there, which you can read. And then after the war, we had the books that so many of us read when we were children. There's just 3 of them. But 2 of those books they do reveal some of the difficulties that were faced. But they were revealed by the authors in order to make drama out of the work that they'd done and to sell books. But when you look in more detail, you discover there were facts behind what they were saying. So our favoured image. I'm so grateful to the colorizers who've done this job. It's a terrible Americanism, colorizing, isn't it? But it's amazing what you can do with a computer these days. Hugh Ellis, 21 years old, very famous photograph, Imperial War Museum photograph, normally in black and white with the saint character on his life preserver. Hugh Ellis, very sad story. I'll talk about it in a moment. Sammy Allard, he was a super ace. He was one of the top aces of fighter command. But those images show you the perception of the public of these young, dashing men. Average age of a pilot in the Royal Air Force in fighter command in 1940 was 20 years old. The oldest were in their 30s, but the average age was 20, so they were younger and older. But let's talk about Hugh Ellis for a moment, just quickly. Hugh Ellis was shot down and his aircraft crashed, and they found bits of him all over the place, basically, and they found them twice. So twice he was buried as an unknown airman in those 2 graves you see on the left there. And then eventually in 1990, an illegal excavation of his aircraft discovered more of him, sufficient to do DNA tests and also identification of him. So he was eventually buried correctly. So that's the sort of thing that was happening in 1940. It was so frantic. He didn't come down on some foreign soil, he came down in Britain. And that's him. That photograph, it was black and white then, that photograph was found in the cockpit. There is no footage of the Battle of Britain from the period. There is a documentary that was made in 1941 which purports to try and show it in black and white. But in 1969, a wonderful film was made by Guy Hamilton, and I'm sure many of you have seen it, and it's still worth watching today. Nobody's bettered it. I'm going to show you 2 minutes and 27 seconds of it, because this is the yes, this is the combat sequence. The reason I'm showing it to you is because Rosemary, my wife, and I, we took my father and mother to the premiere in 1969 at the Dominion Tottenham Court Road. We had to let them out of the car somewhere up near Euston because the queues and the people that were out to come and see all these veterans and Dowding come to the premiere of this film was so great that the roads were all closed. We then picked them up afterwards, and my father told me that they'd all sat in the stalls with Dowding in the middle and all the veterans around him. And I said, well, what did you think of the film? He said, well, it's a bloody love story, you know. They've got a woman in it. He was an Australian, don't forget he was an Australian. I said, yeah, but what did it? He said, there's a combat sequence in the middle of it, and that is the closest you can get on a film. And it's got the wonderful music of William Walton, Spitfire, Prelude and Fugue.
Red 3, this is Red 1. Much closer, I can hardly see you. Red 2, you must keep up with me. Right, Red Section, here we go. Stick to me like glue. Red 3, behind you.
So that's as close as we can get to visualize what it must have been like, but it doesn't really come as close as it could possibly come. But this is the frequent reality that that's what they really look like. Those young men, aged 23, 21, 23. Cobbicane was the first ace in the Battle of France. He died. Can you see the tiredness in their faces? The stress that they were under. The tiredness was the big thing that hit them most. Exhaustion. 1941, Gardner, 32 Squadron, 20-year-olds, fast asleep, one sucking his thumb. So let's talk about some of the things that I've discovered over the years. Equipment deficiencies, the fact that the Germans helped us enormously by their huge mistakes because of the way they were led strategically by that fat man Goering, drug addict, but not all bad, he's a model railway enthusiast as well. But he is arguing with his two most senior commanders there, and that's the famous occasion where Gallam said that when he asked Gallam what he wanted, he said, "I want a squadron of Spitfires." So that's the thing we often forget, that a lot of the way that things went was as a result of the enemy's mistakes as well as our own. Squadron tactical leadership I'm going to talk about in detail. Political attitudes. Germany was not helpful to their Luftwaffe. It is interesting that as far as the Royal Air Force was concerned, particularly in the Battle of Britain, Churchill did not intervene once. When you think of the man as being the strategist and the military man that he was, you would have expected perhaps that he would have been talking to Dowding on a regular basis and advising him. No, he listened. He knew that what was being done was the right thing. So political issues were not that big a problem for us. Public attitudes, they were all heroes. They could do no wrong. Wherever they went, they didn't have to buy a drink. They drank a lot. Psychological issues were not discussed, and I'm going to talk quite more about those. Propaganda tensions, yes, the newspapers were filled with material that boosted morale but also upset morale. And we had problems with equipment. They were not well equipped in every area. That rear view mirror was out of an Austin 7 fitted by the pilot, well, his ground crew fitted it for him. Rear view mirrors did not come in until the middle of the Battle of Britain. Our life saving, 0. Most of our pilots were picked up by the RNLI, fishing boats, and occasional rescue launches if they were available. Not until after the Battle of Britain did we have a really sorted air-sea rescue service. On the same day that that little boat went out in that dinghy with a couple of soldiers and picked that man up, 2 men died just around the corner of the Isle of Wight. They died because one died, one survived. The one that survived, they'd all been issued the day before with a little pouch of fluorescein, a fluorescent material that you let go, and because they had no dinghy, their Mae West, as it was called, after a famous actress, their life preserver was sea green, so they were invisible from the air. And then the Germans had this dye, which you let go, and there was a big green patch around you, and you could be seen from the air. So it was advised that the Royal Air Force did this. In July 1940, they issued everybody with these packs. And the day that they were issued, one squadron, one pilot and his mate, he sewed it onto his jacket. The other chap didn't. The other chap didn't survive. He did because he had the fluorescein. The number of crews that were lost in the Battle of Britain, about 75% of them went down in the sea and drowned as a result of no real air-sea rescue. Also, gun harmonisation I've already talked about. We had better ammunition because we had bought a flaming round, but our guns were .303 when the Germans had much larger ones. We had aircraft like the one on the right up there. That's a Bolton Paul Defiant. Those who flew it thought it was wonderful. It wasn't wonderful. Performance was poor. This is Glyn Griffiths walking away from his aircraft. It's being refueled with 100 octane fuel. That gave our aeroplanes an extra 10 miles an hour, and we imported it from the United States. But their flying clothing was abysmal in 1939, 1940. Those goggles, they're celluloid. So when the airplane goes up in smoke, they melt into your eyes, which is why you see most film photographs of Battle of Britain pilots wearing motorcycle goggles, because they would either buy those or they were eventually issued. Their oxygen mask is made of canvas, didn't seal very well over them, so a lot of them got hypoxia, and they're going over 10,000 feet, and most fighting was done around 20,000 feet. They had to wear a collar and tie, Van Heusen shirt, with a semi-stiff collar. Okay? And you have to move your head constantly if you're a fighter pilot. Most of them took the collar off, took their tie off, and wore a silk scarf or a roll-neck sweater, unless their squadron or flight commander didn't like it and insisted they wore. And you'll see lots of photographs of them. They had this Irvine jacket with a collar up here. You put that collar up, you can't see an aeroplane behind you. And a lot of them cut the collar off and then got assessed for the damage to the government property. They had no dinghy. That's their seat packed with parachute. Also, strategic leadership, and I'm going to skip this very quickly. I'm showing a picture of Trafford Leigh-Mallory. But there's a quote from Dowding that, looking back on things, I believe I ought to have been very much firmer and stricter with her. Now, some of you present might not know the story of Leigh-Mallory. But basically, it's a story that is inherent in the military in peacetime and, sadly, in war. It's the greasy pole of promotion. And as a civilian, I can refer to it as that because I've seen it with my own eyes. It's people who are more interested in climbing the promotion ladder and putting somebody else out of a job in order to get that job than they are in the men that are fighting for them. And in the case of Leigh-Mallory, he wanted Keith Park's job, who was CNC of 11 Group, the main group in the south of England, and he did everything he could in order to get that job. Somebody was once quoted as saying that if you saw Keith Park in a white coat and Trafford Leigh-Mallory in a white coat, one you would think was a doctor, the other you'd think was a lab technician. I would leave it to you to decide which. This is something that I recommend you all look at. I'm sure those of you in business know about the 80-20 law. This applies just as much, it applies to everything. It applies to us in this room at the moment. 10% of you are very interested, 80% of you couldn't really care, and 10% of you won't go home or go to sleep. That's the 80-20 law, the Pareto principle. But if you look, I'm not going to go through it. These are the aces, 10%. I'm going to use the word coward once. The cowards are 10% because this is the academic version. And in the middle, you have the 80% of people who really do their job and they make it possible for the aces to get so many kills and so on. So this was applying, and nobody really worked it out, that this was natural, this was what was going to happen. So when we look at tactical leadership, I've actually drawn up a list of the squadrons that it's quite easy to research and find that they had problems with leadership and people were moved on. I talked about 17 Squadron, 5 squadron commanders in 2 weeks. It's at the top of the list there. This particular one didn't lead a squadron in France. He was 35 years old. 46 Squadron was posted away after a week. He was 32 years old. You get the theme. These are not young men. These have got families. They joined the Royal Air Force when it was a country club, when they enjoyed the flying and they enjoyed the sport. Now they're having to make decisions. But it's not always like that. Some of them were really, really conscious of their inability to lead, so they allowed somebody else to lead. And that's quite frequent. So you can't just look at the statistics and say, oh, posted away or whatever, he must have been poor at his job or whatever. It was not necessarily the case. It was, however, the case definitely with 242 and 257, and I picked those out because those are mentioned in Douglas Bader's Reach for the Sky book and in Bob Stanford Tuck's book as well. So they are actually picked out, and they have to live with that for the rest of their lives. And for the let's just go for Squadron Leader Goubel, a Canadian. They wanted to form a Canadian squadron, 242 squadron. They wanted to form that squadron and have it all Canadian. And they decided they would have a Canadian to command it. The Royal Air Force decided. So they picked somebody out of a training unit who happened to just be in the UK at the time. And they told him to find Canadians within the Royal Air Force to form the squadron before the Canadian government could send squadrons over at the start of the war. And poor old Goubel immediately fell into the trap of being a colonial trying to do things in the Royal Air Force. He had no aeroplanes. They wouldn't give him any aeroplanes. He had no crews. Nobody wanted to be posted to a squadron with no aeroplanes and with a Canadian squadron. And he had the most difficult time. When they went over to France for the Battle of France, he made some enemies because he reported on his adjutant and one of his pilots and asked for them to be posted. They then started to report back that he was incompetent. When they came back to England, he was sent back to Canada, told never to come back to the UK again, and his career was blighted for the rest of his life. but he fought back, and he fought very hard. He was the first person to pilot a glider over the Atlantic, towed by a C-47 Dakota. He flew it over the Atlantic to test the system of bringing, like convoys of ships. They loaded the gliders with tons of materials, important material. He was the one who did it. He retired as a group captain, and his reputation has slowly been put back to place after. Harkness, on the other hand, is there as a quote there, and you can read it and you can see that he is a good example of somebody who could not cope with the leadership and ended up saying, I can't do it, and stopped, was posted away, and eventually resigned from the Royal Air Force. And this is one of the reasons why. Just look at that. That's a day in the life. That's an extract straight from one of my father's logbooks of one day in the Battle of Britain. And this is Dennis Gillen talking about it.
One was called about 4 in the morning, and we went down to dispersal in the half-light, and breakfast brought down to 1. And then we generally scrambled about 7 or 8 o'clock, first grade, and then you came back, refueled and rearmed, and they brought sandwiches down to 1 at the dispersal, and then you got scrambled again and another battle, and probably a third in the afternoon reading, and then towards dusk they would ease up, and you was on readiness until started dark. At the end of our tour, when there were only 3 or 4 of us, they were even asking us to night fly, which was very hard because we really were not getting enough sleep, and this was very hard. In fact, one night I went off after a raid, and I think I went to sleep in the cockpit because next thing I knew the speed was building up and there were lights in front of me, and I couldn't make out what it was. I realized I was upside down and diving hard ground. But this was entirely due to fatigue. I think the evening raid was the worst, in that one had already flown 3 or 4 sorties and probably lost 3 or 4 pilots, and reduced down in numbers. Then you had another go, and one was getting tired.
I think that's an understatement. I think they all felt this, and morale and fear went together, particularly when you were fighting at that sort of level of number of flights per day, single engine, over water a lot of the time, often in, as you said, night flying, a day fighter. The only protection you had from the flames coming out of the open exhausts were 2 pieces of aluminium, they called them blinkers, that were riveted between you and the exhaust pipes. That's the only protection you had from the flames that were coming out of the engine in front of you. Very, very difficult. Bertie Wilson was a good friend of mine, flew with my father in 17 Squadron, and he says this about pilots being afraid.
You read many stories nowadays of pilots saying that they weren't worried and weren't frightened when they saw little dots in the sky which gradually increased in numbers and grew in size as they came from the French coast towards the English over Kent and towards London. I maintain that if anybody says that they weren't frightened or apprehensive at such an occasion, then I think he's a very bad liar, because you cannot help but get worried. And I openly admit that I was worried, and I was frightened at the time. As the battle went on and on, we were praying for bad weather. The only time in England I think anybody ever prayed for bad weather. Somehow during the whole of the battle we had beautiful weather, sunshine and blue skies, and we prayed mighty hard. The fatigue broke into a chap's mentality in most peculiar ways. Some really felt the jitters and facial twitches and stuff like that. Others, as I did, I had I had nightmares at night. I admit it that I used to wake up in the dispersal hut, sleeping within 25 yards of my aircraft, and I was night flying my Hurricane. And this went on for quite a long time.
They had a word for it: lack of moral fibre. The term came as a construction. If you'd like to read that while I'm talking, it's an entry from my father's biography, where he talked about going to Royal Air Force East Church, which everybody knew as the lack of moral fibre unit. That's where you'd be sent if you were a coward. Lack of moral fibre was a term, it was not a medical term. It wasn't a term that the medics had come up with. It wasn't a diagnosis. And it wasn't a diagnosis because the government had decreed that there would be no such thing as shell shock in the Second World War. It was a medically diagnosed condition from the First World War, and because of that, there were still tens of thousands of men receiving government pensions by the start of the Second World War as a result of being diagnosed with shell shock. So the term shell shock was not allowed. The term coward was not allowed. So they came up with this term lack of moral fibre. And the doctors said, well, we can't diagnose this. They said, no, well, if the person is in such a state that they refuse to fly, or they can't fly, or they've got the twitch and so on, then you must first of all decide whether they're medically fit or not. If you can't find anything to diagnose them with, you pass it back to us and we will classify them as LMF and we will dispose of them. And they had places called aircrew disposal units. That was the term. Or aircrew relocation units. And the main one was at RAF East Church. And I remember my father dictated this over, and I wrote the book from his dictation. He's worried about going there with his new squadron that he's just got up to operational status, coming down from Scotland to come down before D-Day and go into ops again. And he's worried about staying at this place at East Church because everybody knows that's where everybody is the IMF. And this was what was hanging over all of these fighter pilots, not just fighter pilots actually, but it was hanging over the fighter pilots in that period, was the fact that if they did not in any way perform, they would be categorized. And they made it worse than that. The philosophy was that the person was a coward, but they needed to find another word for it. And that they thought that men of strength of character were immune to this. They did not seem to get the connection between the fatigue and the combats that were taking place and the seeing your mate go down. My father was shot down in flames. He saw his best mate go into the ground without getting out of his aeroplane. Those sorts of things were happening to young men every day. But they considered neurosis was an infectious disease and it was catching. So if you had somebody on the squadron, this got even worse in the later part of the war with Bomber Command, when you had crews of many people, it was so infectious that the person had to be removed from the unit immediately. That meant that if your chum was just posted somewhere else for some training or a course somewhere or went on leave and you hadn't spoken to before he left, the fact that he went immediately, everybody was assumed to have LMF. And it was a progressive thing. Nobody ever said anything. Everybody just assumed, and the Royal Air Force was quite happy for this to continue. The interesting thing is that when you look at the statistics, 35% of people who were not diagnosed, can't use that word, but who were declared LMF went back to flying. 5% returned to limited flying duty and 60% were grounded. I'm going to just cut this bit of audio so you can look at the scheme. This is an original document. And it was the shortage of aircrew. September 1940, we had lots of aeroplanes. We were producing aeroplanes, larger quantities than the Germans. We did not have the pilots. And those pilots we did have were inexperienced and not so well trained. So we did not want to lose the experienced pilots, so we put things in place to stop that happening. Again, the shell shock element, pseudo-psychiatric premise with There were huge numbers of disagreements within the medics over this, but the service chiefs overruled them and said, no, we will have this. And they set up a system, and the interesting thing is that if you take this flowchart thing that they constructed with their old typewriters in those days, they've got the flying stations coming down to special diagnostic centres, treatment in hospital, and then the 3 routes: duty, convalescence, or invaliding. One they've missed out is cashiering and throwing out, because that's what everybody was threatened with. The Waverer letter, September 1940, they came up with another word. These weren't just lack of moral fibre victims or people, they were waverers. You couldn't rely on them. Worse than that, they would have that attached to them, they would be called that, they would be told that. And it wasn't the decision or the diagnosis of a medic. It was after the medics had said there's nothing wrong with them that I can treat. It was then decided by their commander, station commander usually. It was passed up the chain of command. And here again you have the separation in hierarchy. If they were officers, they were invited to resign, or if they refused, they were cashiered. If they were NCOs, they were sent to the infantry or the mines. But the things that they were told would happen to them were really quite shocking. They were told that they would be paraded in front of their cohort. But prior to the parade, that their badges, flying badges, of which every pilot is so proud, their flying badge would be, the sewing of it would be loosened. Their badges of rank, sergeant stripes, would be loosened. They would be paraded in front of their colleagues, and those badges would be ripped off. There's no witness evidence that this ever happened. There's apocryphal evidence that this happened, but this is what they believed would happen. They were also told that this letter W would be stamped on their discharge papers for any employer in Civvy Street after the war or wherever would know that this person had been discharged from military service because they were a waverer. And these are the centres they set up all over the country. The main one here is the East Church, but all these places were so-called hospitals where they would judge whether they were LMF or not. Did it work? Well, it worked in the sense that pilots of 1940 did not stop flying for fear not of the fact that they were ill or whatever, for fear of the repercussions that would happen. And I believe that the term LMF in the military is still occasionally used. They were often more frightened of the RAF's LMF policy than they were of fighting, even when they were petrified. They fought on in spite of the fears that they all had. There were very few fearless pilots. In fact, my father flew with a fearless pilot as his wingman, and a man called Shanin, who amassed about 28 victories and became an SOE agent after his time in fighter command. Totally fearless. Count Manfred Shanin, lovely book called Double Mission, all about him. He just would fly straight into an enemy formation and take his wingman with him, and whoever was with him would probably get shot down. But he wanted to kill Germans. And there were a few of those. But the 80-20 law applied significantly to the 80% in terms of fear. But when you look at the statistics, I put the polls up here because that's the highest scoring squadron in fighter command in the Battle of Britain. The RAF establishment of World War II at its height was 1,171,421 people. 0.03% were classified as LMF. So I'm labouring a point merely to show you that they believed something was so real that it affected their performance, but it actually affected so few people it wasn't real at all. And I'll finish by just telling the story, or let Grumpy Unwin tell the story, of Jock Roden, who is a classic example of what I've been talking about.
But there was a thing in the war of lack of moral fibre. Did you come across that?
Well, that was polite term for cowardice, wasn't it? That was the one term. I never came across lack of moral fibre in a fighter squadron, no, never. Quite the opposite. I knew one chap who was scared stiff. I won't tell you his name, although it's no disrespect to him. Well, I will actually, because it really pats him on the back. A fellow called Rowland, Sergeant Rowland, was in my squadron, and he hated it. But he wouldn't give in. He should have been taken off, genuinely taken off, and put onto some other form. But no way, and he was killed. But he hated it. I won't say he was scared, he hated it. And but no way would he give in. Now I think that is courage of a different kind altogether. But he was unfortunately killed in 1940. He was bound to be killed. Bound to be killed. Really was. He should never have been allowed to carry on. And there it is. He wouldn't make it, let it be known. We knew the sergeant's mess, but the officers couldn't find out. But there was.
And that was one of the reasons why you don't have NCO pilots, or the Royal Air Force doesn't have NCO pilots, and didn't a few years later, was because the officer's role in any military is to look after their men. Well, how can you look after your men if they're in a different mess and they're not socialising with you, except occasionally perhaps in the pub, and they used to socialise a lot in the pub, and they used to talk a lot in the crew room. But you can't put your arm around somebody in another mess when you're not allowed in there without permission. The NCOs suffered more than the officers in more than one way. But all of them, when you think about it, the few were actually even braver than we thought. The few suffered things that we couldn't imagine today, and they still carried on fighting, even when they knew they were going to be killed, like Jack Roden here. And of course, none of them are left now. The last one left us quite recently. So the takeaway from this, I think, is that these men weren't just battling the Luftwaffe as an enemy. They were battling the enemy in their own soul, ladies and gentlemen. They were going to work every day, watching their friends die, and they were still doing it day after day, even when they might have been poorly led, or they knew what they were being asked to do wasn't the right way of doing it. They were braver than we thought, mate. Thank you very much.
Well, that gave us food for thought, didn't it? Thank you so much, Michael. That was just, mind-bogglingly moving in places. Really appreciate that. I'm sure there are a lot of questions. We've got about 10 minutes or so for some questions. So, if anyone has a question they'd like to put tonight on.
I would just like to say, Master, I've managed to condense an academic paper that is about 40 pages long with all the references in it, down to the 1 hour talk I gave tonight. That paper will be available on the Air Pilot's website as soon as we can put it available.
Yes, sir.
One question is, you said that 30% went back to flying. It'd be very interesting to know if their casualty rate was higher than normal.
The 30% that went back to flying, it's unlikely they went back to operational flying. They were usually channeled into instructing, which was almost as dangerous as operational flying. They were instructing or into a ground job that involved flying but not operational flying. The majority of the 30%, the statistics are in my paper. Don't have them in here. Yes?
Is there some sort of feeling for how long someone had been flying before this happened? Is there a sort of like a bell curve or something? Because presumably there were pilots that just got worn out and one day just wouldn't walk to the machine, and people conversely who from day one thought, what the hell am I doing?
Did you all hear the question? There is not a bell curve. It depended which group they flew with. The most extreme that I've been talking about is 11 Group, which was the southeast of England, the closest to the enemy, so to speak. Those that were in other groups did not have their time between starting to feel the effects of combat fatigue, as we would now call it, was longer. But also, one thing that we did, which was very, and Dowding particularly pushed this, he started to realise what was happening, and these young men would not take their leave. They did not want to leave their chums when this was all going on. So they would work on the day they were supposed to be off, or the week they had off every 3 weeks. So he had to insist that squadron commanders ensured that their pilots took their leave, because they weren't doing it. And there are many instances and they also had to go off base to somewhere quiet so that they could actually properly rest. Yes?
What, if any, support was given to the families after somebody went down, or was it non-existent?
A telegram saying you'd receive more information eventually. My grandmother got one of those when my father went down. Funnily enough, the quickest person to react was usually the squadron adjutant, because the organiser, like the clerk of a livery company, they would put the process in place, but there was very little what we would call physical support of next of kin in those days. They'd get a visit, and then they'd get a relatively meagre pension. If you came down and survived, I was very interested to know that the adjutant applied for my father's Caterpillar badge within 24 hours of him hitting the ground. Caterpillar badge is for anybody who comes down with a parachute. You get it from the company who made the parachute, the Irvine Parachute Company. Little gold silkworm with a ruby eye. And the adjutant was on the blower to the company within 24 hours. He's still in hospital, blind and burnt, and he's getting him his Caterpillar badge. But the families weren't that well treated. Yes?
Was there argument between Lee Mallory and Park regarding the rest period, etc.?
No, not. Park agreed with the rest periods. Lee Mallory was ambivalent about it because 12 Group was not as pressured as 11 Group was. And Lee Mallory also had bigger fish to fry. He wasn't that interested in that sort of thing. Although the interesting thing was he would constantly send signals to 11 Group squadrons on the borders of 12 Group, congratulating them on their day's work, which is odd. He would send them to Debden, which was 11 Group, and 12 Group was Duxford, which is very close. Interesting character, Lee Mallory, in many ways. Yes?
Which stage, or what stage of the war did they start training pilots in Canada?
In Canada? We started, well, we had so many schemes, the Arnold scheme, the Pan Am scheme, the Empire schemes and so on. We had set it all up prior to the war. So the first ones went over in 1940, and the American system didn't get going until after Pearl Harbor. So the BFTSs in the United States were after, but South Africa and Canada right up from day one. The Canadians wanted to send squadrons over at the outbreak of war, but they couldn't. They needed to work them up. But they came over in 1940, Canadian squadrons. Big mistake that was made in the Royal Air Force by Commonwealth governments was the decision by the Australian government to have all Australian squadrons. And it was a mistake because up until that time, the squadrons were a mix. They had a New Zealand, they had an Australian, they had a Kiwi, they had a South African, they had a Canadian, and it was all a great mix. But later on in the war, when the Australians insisted, they ended up having large bomber raids on places where a whole town of Australians were lost all from one place. And that was the bad thing about the nationalism of the squadron system. But initially, I mean, my father's squadron had about 7 or 8 different nationalities in it. Yes, sir. Right at the very far back.
You mentioned the one of the Polish squadrons at some point. One hears a lot about Polish fighter pilots. What sort of proportion did they make of the view?
Well, on the top of my head, I don't have the numbers, but my recollection is there were 2 all-Polish squadrons, and somebody else might know the exact facts, but they made a sizable contribution because they were so tenacious, and they were pretty well trained and combat trained by the time and the route they had done, not just the Poles, the Czechs as well. The route to get to our country in order to fight against the Germans was incredible too. So they were all men of huge resource and huge determination. Their biggest problem in the early years was their language barrier, but they soon got over that. But they were the top scoring squadrons in the battle room. Yes?
This is another training question. And perhaps you could say something about how training changed in the early part of the war. Late after Marshall at Cambridge Airport claims that between the wars he had to train a lot of pilots, worked out a scheme where he could train a pilot to fly an aeroplane, not necessarily do combat work, but to fly in 11 weeks. And it took quite a while to persuade the air industry to adopt his procedure. I'd like your view on.
Well, they were the elementary flying training schools for the Royal Air Force Volunteer Reserves. They would go to an elementary flying training school like Cambridge, and they would learn the basics. They would go solo and learn a bit of navigation. Then they'd go to a higher performance aircraft similar to the Spitfire or the Hurricane that they would fly on operations, and that was usually the Harvard and the Master, Miles Master, and that would take their level of flying up to a high performance aircraft. And then they go to an operational training unit, but they were not in position until after the Battle of Britain. So the operational training was done on the squadron. So they'd had their basic flying training at somewhere like Cambridge or Brize Norton, Brize Norton was a high performance. They would then go to a high performance, and then they would not have the combat and the tactical training that they would have it in the classroom. Often at Cambridge University, for example, they commandeered universities to teach ground school. So they would have the theory, but they would never have put it into practice in an aeroplane. And more than that, they may turn up at a squadron with only 10 hours of actually flying the operational aeroplane they were in. It was then up to the squadron to teach them what they needed to know in combat. But it's sad to say that I think I shared an office with Bob Stanford Tuck, who one of the books you saw there, Fight for the Sky, I shared an office with him, and he told me in between telephone calls to New Zealand at the government's expense, he told me that he actually had a chap join his squadron with this suitcase, and the suitcase was returned to his family at the end of the day. That's how long he lasted. This is how little training they had on some squadron, mainly 11 Group, the far southeast of England.
I think we have time for one more quick question, but Michael will be around afterwards in the bar.
Hello, Roger. Nice to see you.
You said at the beginning that things in the Isle changed after the war.
After the Battle of Britain, 1941 onwards, huge changes. They recognised the LMF element, the psychological bit that I talked about, that just got worse because the problem got worse. You had many, many more men, and they were in crews, so it was treated as an infectious disease. But all the equipment was changed. Air sea rescue was improved enormously. So all the things that they had not managed to get right by the start of World War II, after the battles of France and the Battle of Britain, they really worked very hard to get it right.
Thank you. I'm going to hand over to Warden Steve Dean, who's going to thank Mr. Chris for a fantastic presentation.
Past Master Dr. Fogg, what a treat we've had this evening. And whilst I hate to raise issue with such a knowledgeable individual, I think if I took a straw poll in this room about the interest level and the knowledge that people have gained this evening on your talk, that I could disprove your 80-20. We've all learnt so much this evening, and personally I've now realised that I served on 17 as a pilot, just in common with your father. But I think what is most refreshing and most interesting is we all know the stories of the big numbers of the battle and the thing that you find in the history books. But it's so refreshing and so interesting to bring out those individual stories and how it affected people, and to hear those accounts from those people, and to see how badly things went and how things that we got wrong. And you know, that's why remembrance is so important, because we still get it wrong today potentially. But Dr. Fogg, I would just like to thank you so much for today's talk, and once again, if you could all just show your appreciation.